So yeah, my name is Catherine. I'm an OT based in East London. I work in a children's community team there, but I'm not here today to talk about my sort of day-to-day work as much, but about another opportunity for students called the Planetary Health Report Card. And this is basically sort of a standardized tool, and it's a way that students, it's used across the world by a range of different healthcare disciplines, but it's quite new to OT. And it's a way for students to sort of investigate their educational experience and think about how is planetary health incorporated into that, and gives them sort of a way to advocate for planetary health. But I'll go into a bit more sort of what that involves in practice as I go on. Lovely. So I'll cover a few different things. Firstly, I'll look at what sort of planetary health is. This might be something that you're quite familiar with, or maybe it's sort of completely unfamiliar to you, or you're somewhere in the middle, but we'll sort of go into a little bit about what that is and what kind of the relationship between climate change and health is currently at the moment. Then I want to have a look at this tool, the PHRC, what it involves, what actually sort of it means to sort of do one of these, some of the outcomes, what are some of the consequences of people having sort of got involved in this. And then most importantly, we want to think about you, the educators, what sort of, how can you get involved with this? How can you support students in this? And then, yeah, I really want to have a time for questions and discussion that can be thinking about the Planetary Health Report Card, but also just more generally about planetary health. If there's thoughts, questions, very happy for all of the above. All right, so firstly, what is planetary health? So planetary health is sometimes a term that's used interchangeably with sustainable healthcare, and you may be more familiar with one or the other, but both terms are basically looking at health outcomes and health systems and how they are impacted by climate change, but also how they contribute to the climate crisis as well. So sustainable healthcare, if we're going to look at a bit of a slight sort of semantic difference, sustainable healthcare is a little bit more thinking about how we can sort of quite practically adapt healthcare systems to both provide optimal care for current service users, but at the same time that doesn't sort of jeopardize the care and the health outcomes of future people using those services. And then planetary health is a little bit more abstract. It sort of asks people to think about health in a broader sense, that health isn't just human health, but health of our planet involves the health of different species, different plants, animals, ecosystems. And if we're concerned with human health, we need to be concerned with the health of the planet, because our health doesn't exist in a vacuum. If there's sort of ecosystems and stuff that are sort of not working well, are in jeopardy, that's going to in turn impact human health. And so we're humans, so we're interested in health, but particularly as healthcare clinicians, that's another reason we're additionally interested in that. But while there's sort of a bit of a difference between planetary health and sustainable healthcare, broadly speaking, they're interested in climate change and health and where the two intersect. So before I go on to the Planetary Health Report Card itself, I'm going to look a little bit at what sort of is currently happening with climate change and health outcomes. I'm not going to labour this point too much, because I think we're all quite aware that, you know, the climate crisis is concerning, it's complex, so I don't need to sort of, illustrate that too much to you all, I'm sure. But I do want to sort of flesh out a little bit about what this looks like in practice, particularly in a global sense, not just, it's lovely that we have people here from different countries, because I really think it's about having that more global, international perspective of these issues. But yeah, I think it's important to flesh out what this actually looks like in terms of sort of more tangible health outcomes. So climate and health. So this is all drawn from the Lancet Countdown. So we all know the Lancet Countdown is sort of the sort of part of the Lancet looking specifically at sort of climate change and health. And every year they produce sort of a summary report, and they have a really nice visual summary, which I put a little link to here. And it's really sort of very minimal effort is needed to engage in it. You just scroll through, and it's got some great sort of interactive graphs as well. But I've just chosen to look at health outcomes in the climate through 4 different perspectives. But this is just, there's a few other ways that we can look at this as well, but these are just sort of a few of, I think, sort of the punchier findings. So one way that we might look at climate and health is through sort of heat. So we're kind of aware of global warming, and sort of one of the consequences of that is sort of increase in average global temperatures. Technically, we exceeded the 1.5 degrees above sort of pre-industrial levels at the start of last year, so of the average temperature last year, but sort of still somewhat on technicality. But as we see that sort of increase in global temperatures, we see that impact mortality rates, particularly in vulnerable populations. So we've seen an increase in sort of heat-related deaths in sort of 65 and over populations over the last 30 years. But I think we as OTs, obviously we're concerned with mortality rates and health outcomes, but we're also concerned with sort of everyday occupations. And so they also highlight that sort of there's been a significant amount of labour hours lost, sort of contributing to sort of possible occupational deprivation, which in turn has sort of economic consequences, with sort of an estimated loss of $835 billion as a consequence of these lost labour hours. So heat is one way of looking at this. Another perspective is extreme weather events. So we've seen this already in this year with sort of wildfires in California, but another example of this is also extreme precipitation and extreme droughts. So over the majority of global land has seen an increase in extreme precipitation last year, and also almost half of global land has seen one extreme drought month in 2023. And the reason this is of a concern to health and social outcomes is the damage these weather events can do to infrastructure, to homes, to health and social care services, but also what it can do to things like crops and farming, which then leads me to the third perspective, which is food insecurity. And so there's an estimated 150 million more people experiencing food insecurity across a real spread of places over 124 countries, which in turn, of course, impacts health outcomes. And it's a mixture of these sort of extreme weather events combined with downstream effects like damage to infrastructure and sort of food systems and water systems, that there's sort of an estimated 1 billion potential climate refugees by the year 2050. So that's sort of another perspective. And a fourth and final one is an increase in infectious diseases. We see this particularly in pathogens like dengue causing pathogens. And this is a consequence of that increased temperature, which sort of creates more hospitable environments for these pathogens, but also extreme weather events, which particularly can cause damage to things like water systems, which sort of increase rates at which sort of waterborne diseases can be spread. So yeah, this is just a perspective on some of the ways that the climate crisis is already impacting health. And basically, I want to sort of bring the idea that this is not something that we're sort of going to be grappling with 100 years in the future, but this is something that we're going to have to deal with across the world increasingly in our current sort of working professional lives. And the question then is, are we doing enough to mitigate the consequences of climate change? So this is a graph from the UN's IPCC report. So this is the most recent one. So this is their Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And so we see here in this sort of bold red line, sort of the estimated effect that current implemented policies, this is obviously a couple of years sort of ago, but sort of current implemented policies, and then where that is in relation to what needs to be done to limit warming to 1.5 or even 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels. So we see a bit of a discrepancy. So I'm gonna wrap up the slightly more depressing statistics there and think about, now we've understood what the state of play is, but what can we actually practically do? Particularly as OTs, I think we're interested in positive and practical change. And yeah, so looking now at what the NHS is currently doing. Sorry, I didn't realise we'd have a global audience, otherwise I would have tailored it to being a bit more international. So the NHS currently sort of estimated that in terms of the UK's average sort of carbon and greenhouse emissions, the NHS contributes about 4% to that overall national output. So it's a fairly significant amount, and that's in keeping roughly with other European the amount that healthcare systems contribute to their national emissions. But that can sort of increase somewhat in other countries like Australia. I think it goes up to about 7% of their national emissions and about 10% in the US. So overall, healthcare systems globally do contribute a significant amount to greenhouse emissions. And what's been really lovely about the NHS, and particularly Green NHS, which is the branch of the NHS concerned with sustainability, is that they were sort of one of the first in the world to set net zero targets for their healthcare system. So in this first diagram here, in scope 1 for direct emissions, the hope is by 2040 for those to be carbon neutral. And then for sort of indirect emissions, that's thinking about things that are not so much within the NHS or hospitals' direct control, like for instance, sort of pharmaceutical production, distribution, sourcing of catering, and that kind of thing, construction as well. The hope is to be net sort of carbon neutral by 2045. So it's really nice to see that those sorts of arrangements are in place. And what Green NHS has also done is sort of provide this second table here to sort of have a look at what particular parts of healthcare are actually having the biggest carbon footprint. So it's not sort of terribly surprising that areas like acute healthcare, which of course are the most sort of, they require the most resources, are also going to be the most sort of polluting in terms of not just carbon, but general sort of greenhouse emissions, and also things like medical waste. You also see in primary care as well, there's fairly significant sort of contributions, particularly when it comes to medicines and chemicals. And of that sort of that 4% that the NHS contributes to sort of UK greenhouse emissions, 20% of that 4% comes just from medicines and pharmaceuticals. So it's a really sort of sizable contribution, and that includes both the production, the distribution, and often the disposal of kind of not used medicines. So that's the current state of play for the NHS. Bringing it now to us as OTs, where are we at with this? What kind of things are currently in place? So a couple years ago, ARCOT did a survey of sort of just shy of about 2,000 OTs in the UK. And it's really lovely to see that a really clear majority felt that we, specifically in our clinical role, have a part to play in reducing our impact on the planet and the contribution that our clinical work can have to climate change. But when these same OTs were then asked how confident and how able they felt to take action, there's quite a significant decrease from 95% to 55%. And this sort of decreases a little bit more when, again, there are sort of their confidence in their ability to influence other health and social care professionals. And what this survey demonstrates to me then is that there's this sort of discrepancy between what OTs would like to do and what we feel is important to do, and our ability to act on that, to act on those convictions. And I think likely what is the cause of that is essentially a lack of knowledge, skills, and sort of experience to sort of act on this desire to want to make our clinical work more sustainable. And what that then points me towards is education. It's the most sort of systematic way that we can address things like skills, knowledge, and experience. So if education is the issue, how then can we use education and think about education to better incorporate planetary health knowledge, awareness, and ability to sort of to act on that knowledge and skills in our clinical practice? So this leads me to the Planetary Health Report Card. So the PHRC, which I'll call it for short, is a tool. It's a standardized set of metrics or questions, and this is carried out by students at different universities. And the purpose of them asking these questions is to investigate how much planetary health is incorporated into their overall educational experience. So these teams of students will look at just their university, just their course, for instance, occupational therapy, and just over the last 12 months. So it's a very sort of set area of time and sort of particular education that they're looking at. And the hope is that they'll fill out these questions, different amounts of points are available for these different questions, and an overall grade is produced by adding up those points. So it's a report card in quite like a literal sense. It's from the US, hence why sort of the language is a bit more American. And the hope then is that by sort of doing this investigation, it highlights firstly what's going well, what kind of things are already in place to promote planetary health, to give that skills, those knowledge, but then also highlight possible areas for development, for improvement. And the hope then is that if this is repeated on an annual basis, those sort of development points can be incorporated over the next 12 months. So the next team of students that are looking at this, that are sort of doing the same set of questions, will then be able to award more points, get a better grade. I very much like to emphasize the point is not about grades or points. The point is about essentially empowering students to have a better understanding of planetary health and a better, basically a good opportunity to advocate for that across their university amongst students, but also with teaching staff as well. So this came, like I mentioned, from the US. So it started in 2019 with sort of 2 medical schools on the east coast of the US, and they based this idea on what was an already existing sort of racial justice report card, and it took the idea of examining how much racial justice and systemic racism, how much it was being taught in order to enable people to incorporate that knowledge into their professional life. Took that idea and then applied that to planetary health, and they developed this sort of systematic set of questions, which originally was just for medical students. And so the idea is that a different report card would be produced for each initially just medical school taking part in this. So whether you are a medical school, a medical student in Liverpool University or in Stanford University, you're just looking at your respective medical schools. You're not sort of looking at medical schools across the world or anything like that. That would be way too much. And so from this, this sort of report card was produced, and in sort of subsequent years, it's really grown. So I think last year, over 150 universities across the world participated. And this was everywhere from the US to Japan to Rwanda to Germany. It's been sort of translated into a few languages now as well. But more than just having grown geographically, it's also sort of diversified into different healthcare disciplines. So initially it was just medical students taking part, but now there's about 7 different disciplines that have their own specific report cards. So that includes medicine, nursing, pharmacy, physio, vet med, so also sort of animal healthcare as well, dentistry and occupational therapy, of course. So that's kind of what it is. I've mentioned these various sort of standardized questions, but you might be thinking, well, what does that actually involve? So across the different disciplines, they all follow the same sort of format of having these 5 different sections. The first of which is the curriculum. So for OT, that's looking at, for instance, how are particular healthcare conditions impacted by the climate crisis? Is that sort of taught about how sort of cardiovascular conditions, how mental health conditions, how even sort of reproductive health might be impacted by the climate crisis? But it's also sort of thinking about things specifically that OTs would be concerned with, like, for instance, sustainable equipment, sort of prescribing, sort of sustainable environmental adaptations, but also, again, more broadly, how much are students being equipped to have conversations with service users about sort of environmental risk factors, that sort of thing. So that's what the curriculum section is looking at, and it's the biggest section by quite a way. And the next one is interdisciplinary research, and this is interested in, is there research going on, for instance, within your occupational therapy department that looks at planetary health? Are students able to get involved in this kind of research at all? What kind of opportunities are available for them? The third section is then community outreach and advocacy, and this is looking at the relationships that your university department might have with community groups that might champion sustainable healthcare or climate justice, but also what relationships does your department have with the affiliated university hospital for providing sort of resources on placement, or for those recently graduated that might look at planetary health. The fourth section is student-led initiatives, and this is about any opportunities that students might have sort of beyond the core curriculum to get involved in climate advocacy or justice, student representation to sort of promote planetary health within the curriculum, or even just sort of broader sort of conservation opportunities to do with the university. And the fifth and final section is campus-wide sustainability. And this is just about how sustainable the campus is, sort of beyond just your OT department, for instance, but sort of what's the energy sources at the school? Are they using fossil fuels or more sustainable resources? The cafeteria, do they have plant-based options? is the university investing in fossil fuel companies, that sort of thing. So it's very broad, that section. And particularly this last one here, students are really encouraged to sort of collaborate with other sort of teams at their school, at their university. So for instance, while there might only be one occupational therapy team at sort of the University of Brighton, to give an example, there could also be a physio team doing a separate report card looking at physiotherapy and that department. There might also be a separate team from Brighton, which is sort of a medical school team. But they can all sort of collaborate on this final section because they're, of course, all on the same campus. So it's encouraged that there's going to be that sort of work together, and you can also lighten the load that way a bit as well. So a little bit about me. What's my relationship to this? Why am I here? So I got involved in sustainable sort of healthcare things while I was still a student. I've sort of been interested in sustainability for a while, so I did an internship with the Centre for Sustainable Healthcare, which some of you might have heard of. It's a UK-based NGO that basically collects data information in order to produce resources for clinicians, a whole range of healthcare clinicians, to enable them to practice sustainably and do things like sustainable quality improvement projects. So I worked with them for a bit, and that through then I sort of kept hearing about this sort of PHRC, and I thought, what is this? And then one day I just sort of went on the PHRC website and I was like, this is really interesting, but there was no OT version of it. So I thought, this is when I was still studying, I was like, maybe I could do something here. Thankfully, there were other people also interested in developing an OT version of this. So myself and a lecturer from Oxford Brookes adapted sort of current templates for OT, and then I ran the pilot of it with some other students at my university, UEA, last year. And that was sort of the pilot of it then. So this academic year, I'm still sort of no longer a student, alas, but I am still sort of working with the PHRC as an OT lead. And so basically what I do there is I support any OTs across the world who might be interested in doing one of these report cards, answering their questions, supporting them as they sort of produce this actual report card. So that's my sort of relationship to this. A few of the practicals. So I've mentioned that this happens on an annual basis and sort of follows a Northern Hemisphere academic year. So typically how this works is in sort of September, October, student teams are sort of assembled and gathered. They might sort of get staff on board, not to complete the report card, but to sort of help with sort of consulting and sort of getting more information and that sort of thing. And there's also an orientation offered by the leadership team to sort of equip people and students to actually complete one of these report cards. And so now we're in the phase where different teams are currently sort of filling out the PHRCs, and the hope is that sort of middle to end of next month, a sort of first draft is submitted. So for instance, OTs completing it submit the draft to me, I then edit it, not so much to change any of the answers, but more to sort of think about, because evidence is expected to be given for each of the questions asked, and to justify the amount of points given. So I sort of check, does that make sense? Is the formatting okay? That sort of thing. And then a second draft is completed at the end of March, and the hope is then on Earth Day, the 22nd of April, all the report cards go live. So they're all published on the website, on the PHRC website. And this is firstly just so students can sort of celebrate the work that they've done. But also what's really nice is then you can sort of look at what other universities are doing and go, oh, that's a really good idea. Maybe we could sort of incorporate some of those ideas into our course and into our sort of educational experience. So it's a great opportunity to sort of have that collaboration, have that sort of that sharing of findings. And what's a real hope of the PHRC as well is that students, they've put in all this work, and there's sort of various opportunities to try and sort of get further sort of publication or sort of speaking opportunities following the work that they've done. So I published some posters in some sustainable healthcare conferences and got to speak at an NHS conference last year as well. So I think it's a really nice opportunity for students if they have an interest in sort of sustainability and climate advocacy, but also if they're interested in research or even a combination of the two. So that's kind of some of the practicalities. Some of the outcomes then, like I said, I'm not terribly, don't get bogged down in sort of the grades and the points. I think what's more important is what sort of practical outcomes have happened following this. So and that sort of covered a whole range of these different sort of sections within the report card. So for some universities, they've added new teaching, they've added new assessment of that teaching, and they've added new elective modules which sort of focus on planetary health or more nature-based placements, for instance. Some other universities have then joined planetary health memberships like the Planetary Health Alliance, or they've developed more sort of partnership with university hospitals to include that sort of sustainable healthcare materials and teaching in placements and stuff like that. There's also been sort of greater working relationships with local community groups which sort of champion sustainable healthcare, as well as more regular planetary health communications to students, basically letting them know what's happening, what opportunities are available in regards to planetary health on campus, that sort of thing. And then in terms of sort of campus sustainability, there's been a number of new sort of working groups for students to collaborate with staff members to basically say, this is important to us, this is important that we have this teaching, that we have the sort of this knowledge and skills given to us, and then sort of greater collaboration to sort of, again, increase the kinds of things being taught in universities. So you might be thinking, this is great, this is quite university focused. What does this sort of have to do with you as educators? So there's a couple sort of things I sort of hope could come about as a result of me speaking here. The first one is if you're someone who works with students, or you know people who work with students, it would be amazing if you could signpost them to this opportunity. As the pilot of the OT sort of PHRC was only run last year, it's still pretty new, and sort of I'm really keen to sort of get the word out there. So yeah, if you know anyone who you think might be interested, please do let them know. A second thing I would suggest is also there's been talk with more with UK, a couple of UK universities, but I'm very open if there's sort of a more international interest in this, is offering the PHRC as a placement, so more of a research or sort of managerial OT placement. And there's actually going to be a pilot of that next month, being run by sort of for 2 students for one OT will then sort of facilitate that. So if any of you are interested in maybe sort of further down the line, once this pilot has happened, if you're interested in then sort of facilitating this as a placement in some capacity, I would love to hear from you, either afterwards in the discussion, but I'll also leave my email up as well. So yeah, please do feel free to contact me after this. And then finally, I think like the sort of ARCOT survey sort of demonstrated, I think there's a real interest in planetary health, but not always the know-how or the sort of the current knowledge then sort of act on that in sort of clinical and professional settings. So I'm partly just here to discuss this, to discuss planetary health as a whole. I think it's really important. Hopefully I've illustrated that at the start. This is something that we really need to address in our clinical practice now. And therefore I just sort of want to be here to sort of talk about that and answer any questions you might have about planetary health following this. So that's sort of the 3 options following this, or maybe this is just food for thought. Whatever you want to take from this, please do take from that. That's kind of all from me. Thank you very much for listening. And if you do have any questions or just any thoughts or responses, we'd love to hear all or any of the above. So yeah, thank you very much. I'll stop sharing now.
Oh, that's brilliant. Thank you so much.